Good morning and welcome to today's AEI policy event, Presidents, Politics, and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Is there a new PhD standard? My name is Paul Kupiec. I'm an AEI resident scholar and the organizer of today's event. President Trump has had a particularly difficult time finding and confirming Federal Reserve Board governors. This past spring, two potential nominees were vigorously attacked in the press, and both were forced to withdraw their names from consideration. A common line of attack was that these individuals lacked the proper qualifications for the job. What qualifications are needed to be a Federal Reserve Board governor? The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve Board. In 1913, Congress decreed that the board be comprised of, and I quote, 7 members, including the Secretary of the Treasury and the Controller of the Currency, who shall be members ex officio, and 5 members appointed by the President of the United States by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. In selecting the 5 appointed members of the Federal Reserve Board, not more than one of whom shall be selected from any one Federal Reserve district, the President shall have due regard for a fair representation of the different commercial, industrial, and geographical divisions of the country. Of the 5 members thus appointed by the President, at least 2 shall be persons experienced in banking and finance. The Banking Act of 1935 removed the Secretary of the Treasury and the Controller from the board. It changed the title of the board's executive from governor to chairman, extended the term of the governor to 14 years, and it raised governor pay from $12,000 to $15,000 a year. So you see, there are few legal constraints regarding the qualifications for a Federal Reserve Board governor. An economics PhD is neither necessary nor sufficient. The current Federal Reserve chairman is a lawyer, as is the incoming chair of the European Central Bank. Trump's 2 prior nominees for Fed governor, both well-respected economists, including a lifetime Fed staff economist, failed to receive Senate confirmation. The current Federal Reserve Board has only 2 PhD economists, a rare situation in modern Federal Reserve history. Today, media discussions of nominees primarily focus on the monetary policy implications of a potential appointee. In practice, the Federal Reserve Board shares authority over monetary policy with voting Reserve Bank presidents on the FOMC. However, Federal Reserve Board governors have exclusive control over the Fed's many regulatory functions. Practically speaking, the qualifications for Federal Reserve Board governor, including chairman of the Fed, are entirely political. To be nominated, a person must be politically connected, earn the trust of the president, and be sufficiently adept at politics to earn Senate confirmation. The overriding importance of political skill may help to explain the current deficit of economists on the current Federal Reserve Board, as PhD economists who are also virtuoso politicians are indeed a rare breed. Until recently, a PhD in economics did appear to be de rigueur for a Federal Reserve Board governor. Since 1980, only 1 vice chairman was a non-economist, that was Roger Ferguson, and only 2 chairmen have lacked PhDs, Paul Volcker and Jay Powell. And certainly Paul Volcker has to count as a card-carrying economist, I think, for most of us. Since 1980, by my rough count, there have been 43 individuals who have served as Federal Reserve Board governors, including as chairman. Only 11 were not PhD economists or the equivalent thereof. Should an economics pedigree be an important consideration in the governor confirmation process? The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 stipulates that at least 2 governors have experience in banking and finance, but at that time the Federal Reserve had no formal macroeconomic stabilization and growth mandate as it does today. Should the Federal Reserve Act be amended to require at least some governors have expertise in macroeconomics and monetary theory? Before you answer that, it's useful to consider whether today's PhD training in economics actually imparts the skills needed to successfully manage the Federal Reserve. Do PhD macroeconomists really have the secrets of the temple needed to steer the economy on a low inflation, high employment trajectory? Back in 1977, the AEI hosted an event entitled Professors, Politicians, and Public Policy. Let's just take a moment to revisit the views of this distinguished panel from 42 years ago.
Irving, that is very careful research about, and it's a dispute in medicine. At what point in time did the random patient meeting the random doctor with the random disease turn out to be better off than otherwise? And some say 1910, and others say 1921. They learned a lot from their mistakes, though. They didn't. But what Shaw said in the Revolutionist Handbook and Pocket Companion, in Maxims for Revolutionists, he said, those who can do, those who cannot teach. And that's your problem. You don't like that. You agree with Shaw.
Now, there is, nevertheless, doctors were a profession prior to 1905. And the fact that they may have done you more harm than good on a randomized basis did not stop them from being doctors with a certain claim to expertise. Now, if you're talking about economists, I have a dreadful feeling that we may be at 1903 or 1893. That is, they are the only experts we have.
Just last week, Gerard Baker of the Wall Street Journal offered a different explanation for the board's current deficit of PhD economists. To paraphrase Mr. Baker, the cult of the PhD economist central banker grew out of a search for a solution to the great inflation of the 1960s and 1970s. Politicians ceded power to the technocrats as the only way to stop themselves from printing money. But the great inflation is long gone, and it is no surprise that our political classes have had enough of the genuflecting at the altar of the central bank. Depending on your politics, there may be other downsides to appointing a Fed packed with PhD economists. Many abstract theoretical models in economics formulate policy solutions by modeling the government as a benevolent dictator that can control the economy. Some economists seem to take these theories literally, as many PhDs favor policies that have a larger, more intrusive role for government and regulation. The issue is not new, as a clip from the 1977 panel will show.
But I think we may be leading up to the question of whether the professoriate has characteristic viewpoints, whether there is a general outlook of intellectuals and I'm not going to try that word, academicians as a class.
I wish I hadn't.
Which leads public policy in particular directions. And that's wider than economics, and it's wider than law. And I suppose the book by Ladd and Lipset, to which Mr. Daly referred, shows what we all know from common observation, that in fact professors, particularly at the most prestigious universities, tend rather strongly to be left liberal and to have preferences for more government regulation in economics as in social matters.
To be fair, as Professor Bork mentioned, on average, lawyers are probably just as likely as PhD economists to favor a larger, more intrusive role for government regulation. But again, it depends on the individual. Governors like Dan Tarullo fit the stereotype, but there are governors like Randall Quarles who are exceptions. The Fed certainly needs PhD as economists on staff, but is the country better served when the Board of Governors is dominated by PhD economists? PhDs may be well-trained in economic theory, but does the current state of theory provide the best framework for formulating real-world monetary policy? When it comes to monetary policy, perhaps the words of the great American philosopher Yogi Berra bear remembering. As Yogi said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. An analogy may help clarify the issue. Say you are traveling from Baltimore, Maryland to Lisbon, Portugal by airplane. Abstract models in technology are essential for charting an optimal course. The shortest route, a so-called Great Circle route, is calculated using spherical geometry. Corrections are required to account for the speed and direction of the jet stream, but in most cases, this navigational model plots the fastest, most efficient path from Baltimore to Lisbon. But what if you are sailing from Baltimore to Lisbon? A sailing ship frequently changes course to take advantage of the ever-changing surface winds. The fastest sailing path from Baltimore to Lisbon is unlikely to be the shortest path, but more likely involves tacking back and forth to keep wind in the sails. The airliner's theoretical best path may be completely irrelevant if you're captaining a sailing ship. Managing monetary policy is more like sailing a ship than piloting an airplane. Economic models work best when economic phenomena are static or slowly changing. They are not so accurate when conditions are volatile, like swings in business and consumer expectations. The Fed chairman and governors have a better chance of success if they are good at reading markets and correctly anticipating changes in the economic environment, instead of fixating on economic theories that may require delays of months for additional data to confirm that changes in policy are warranted. Some Fed boards have good sailing records. Boards under William McChesley Martin, at least up to President Johnson's time, boards under Paul Volcker and Greenspan up until the early 2000s were all considered to be pretty good when it came to reading markets and formulating appropriate policy responses. In contrast, boards under Arthur Burns, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen were probably less talented when it came to anticipating economic changes and formulating proactive policy responses. Apparently, some PhD-dominated boards are good at sailing, and others are either unlucky or less attuned to changes in the economic winds that drive the economy. So what qualifications are needed to be a successful Federal Reserve Board governor? Today, we have assembled an all-star panel, and I mean that, of experts who have agreed to share their views. They are, in order they will speak, James Grant, Peter Conti Brown, and Alex Pollock. James Grant founded Grant's Interest Rate Observer in 1983, following a stint at Barron's, where he originated the Current Yield column. His publications include works on financial history, finance, and biography. He is the recipient of the 2015 Gerald Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Business Journalism. Mr. Grant has authored many books, including his most recent book, Bagehot, The Life and Times of the Greatest Victorian. Peter Conti Brown is an assistant professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a financial historian and a legal scholar specializing in central banking, financial regulation, public finance, with a particular focus on the history and the policies of the U.S. Federal Reserve System. He's the author of The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve, and is the editor of 2 other books, and the author and co-author of many scholarly articles. He earned his law degree from Stanford University and his PhD from Princeton. Alex J. Pollock is a distinguished senior fellow at the R Street Institute. Alex's prior positions include resident fellow here at AEI and president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago from 1991 to 2004. Mr. Pollock focuses on financial policy issues, including financial cycles, government-sponsored enterprises, housing finance, banking, central banking, risk and uncertainty, corporate governance, and political responses to financial crisis. He's the author of numerous articles, congressional testimonies, and books, including his most recent book, Finance and Philosophy, Why We Are Always Surprised. Please welcome with me James Grant, our first panelist. Jim?
Paul.
Yours. The floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. And on Bastille Day, what more appropriate occasion to discuss uncollateralized government-issued currency? But the question before the House has to do with governance, and it is a little rich that we are talking about it. The Eccles building, where the Fed does business, was named after a high school dropout. Mariner Eccles, however, compensated for that seeming deficiency by inheriting a lot of money, which is one way to go through life. And let's see, what other exceptions can we find to this? Under William McChesley Martin, PhDs were proscribed from at least his presence at the Fed. He thought that they were inclined to be rigid, dogmatic, and exhibit the personal characteristics of the A student, which is a very difficult set of characteristics to deal with. I don't know, I think that when I think of Bastille Day, of course, I think, as some of us might, of Edmund Burke and his critique, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And Edmund Burke took to task these radicals, these revolutionaries, among other reasons, for their monetary experimentation. They were under the thrall of the physiocrats. And the physiocrats held that land was the best collateral for money, secure, and they stole it. They stole it from the Catholic Church. And on this somewhat tainted collateral rose the edifice of the assignat, the famous or infamous paper currency of revolutionary France. And Burke disapproved of this on all different levels. He hated the confiscation, he hated the currency. But what he said in particular about the currency, I think, is not irrelevant to our present-day monetary controversies. He said that as much as he and his English confreres revered parliaments, they denied that parliaments had it within their power to superimpose a fiat currency against the law of nations. So Burke had in mind a universal monetary system that advantaged no country and no currency. He was speaking the language of the gold standard. I sometimes think with respect to this controversy about qualifications and the like, I think about the ironies. Of course, the Fed, as you know, has a very lively and well-staffed Office of Diversity and Inclusion. It got started around 2010. And to think that this wide open institution would roll its eyes and stop its ears at the prospect of an outsider coming in is almost too rich to discover, much less to discuss in a place like this. And yet that irony is in front of us. Now, I think, to me, the signal error of the present-day governance of the Fed is the adamantine worldview that is informed, if not dictated, by the dogma of advanced macroeconomics. I say advanced certainly with respect to the formidable endnotes and the delicious pages of algebra and the bibliography, although the bibliography is never mentioned much published before 2015 or so. But this worldview of the economic scholar, I think, is at the root of much of what is wrong in our finances. That anything would be wrong in this world of ours is itself a bit of a revelation. Unemployment near half-century lows. The rate of inflation, which some of us learn to watch and to fear and to loathe, this rate of inflation is now struggling, mind you, to reach 2%. And the clerisy at the Fed would have us believe that it's a scandal. We can't get it there. Low inflation, low unemployment, and yet there is an astringency in our financial and monetary affairs that bears closer scrutiny. What might that be, and what might be the source of it? Well, Burke made his point about the almost unspeakable presumption of the French revolutionaries in trying to impose their currency on a world that was used to real money, as he called it. 100 years later came into sight another French scholar. This one actually was a Frenchman. He was a scholar of French affairs. And his name was Pierre-Émile Lavoisier. And he wrote something for the Journal of Political Economy called the Assignat, a study in the finances of the French Revolution. And he asserted at one point in his conclusions that paper money is in itself an evil. And in slightly more technical words, he said this: a government which issues paper cannot regulate the quantity according to the needs of exchange because it has no standard by which to measure those needs. While metallic money, thanks to foreign trade, distributes itself automatically to the needs of exchange. So that was doctrine 100 years after Burke wrote. So let's fast forward another 100+ years to the election of 2012, when the Republican Party pledged that the incoming administration of Mitt Romney would form a commission to study the reinstitution of something resembling the classical gold standard. This particular item in the platform of the GOP was met with outright hoots of derision. And you can conjecture as much because the Booth School of the University of Chicago from time to time conducts a poll of the economic eminences. And by the way, this clock, ladies and gentlemen, I don't say this as a threat to you, but it is stuck at 10 minutes and 23 seconds. I could go on for hours. Now it's working higher. But the Booth School from time to time polls these worthies, and wouldn't you know that out of, say, 100 economists polled, not one single one has anything good to say about the gold standard. Now, I'm not sure if they speak from interest entirely, but there are 700 PhDs in the staff of the Federal Reserve. It is by far, I think, the largest employer of economists, certainly of doctors of economy. And this observation obviously betrays my prejudices. I believe that the current body of dogma that informs our monetary affairs is by and large erroneous. And this would seem to be from somebody who holds a BA degree, not fortunately BS, but a BA degree from Indiana University. This would seem to be an equal presumption to that of the French revolutionaries. I mean to persuade you otherwise, and I would like to tell you in the 50 minutes remaining to me, according to this clock, just what's wrong. There was a book a couple of years ago by Sabine Hassenfelder, who was a German theoretical physicist, and it's called Lost in Math. I'm not sure about you, but I was immediately attached to the title. It conjured up my high school career. And I read it. It was in English, and most accessible English it was. And her argument was that theoretical physics had become seduced by the beauty of theory and had lost touch with empiricism. And towards the end of this, she gets down to the business at hand. She says, yeah, I was looking around for another job. Physics in the theoretical vein does not pay as well as it might. I looked at economics. And she said two things. She said, I found the math unimpressive, and I found the data horrific. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is something called the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service is in the business of forecasting. And to a degree, the Federal Reserve is in the business of forecasting. Now, the National Weather Service takes 76 billion observations of data per year. These are observations of temperature gradients, high pressure systems, raindrops, sleet, all particles without volition. And still, its forecasting horizon is 7 to 10 days. Now, the Fed, in contrast, takes many fewer empirical observations, there being so few opportunities for that. Its data certainly are smaller and less rigorous than those of the Weather Service. The Fed's computing power, as powerful as that is much less formidable than the computers that the National Weather Service mobilizes. And the Fed and its counterparts feel no embarrassment presuming to look out 3, 5, 10 years. There is something called the five-year forward inflation rate, and Mario Draghi is very attached to this. The five-year forward inflation rate, ladies and gentlemen, is that rate of inflation derived from a curve of derivatives pricing for the 5 years beginning 5 years hence. Yeah. And is it going to rain a week from Thursday? Mario Draghi. So So those, I feel that the Federal Reserve, informed as it is by the doctrines and dogma and by the dogmatizing of modern macroeconomics, misses a great deal. It misses a degree what is happening in the world. There is, remember in Gulliver's Travels, there was a flying island called Laputa, and it was governed by educated people, only educated people. And these people, the island was like 4.5 miles in diameter, and the Board of Governors of Laputa could navigate through the forces of magnetic levitation. Levitation. Is that not how our PhDs are working the financial markets? We have today the anomaly bordering on deformation of $13 trillion worth of securities worldwide, priced to yield less than nothing in nominal terms, never before seen in 4,000 years of interest rate history. It will be said, many do say, that this is the fruit in the advance of economic science. And I will conclude because, Paul, I feel sure that I have, okay, I have another half hour. I feel sure that, I will conclude by observing that it is not always the case that the quality of ideas advances with the turn of the calendar. We heard from Daniel Patrick Moynihan about the foibles of modern medicine. There was a doctor named William Osler, who was one of the 4 founding physicians of Johns Hopkins University. And Dr. Osler was the author of one of the best-selling textbooks of all times in medicine, the Principles and Practices of Medicine, I think. And up until the last edition in the 1940s, Dr. Osler prescribed bloodletting as a state-of-the-art technique. There is a fabulous essay by Hugh Trevor Roper that I urge you to look up if you ever have the inclination to read about the history of witchcraft. And I bring this up because when the Republicans were talking about the gold standard, some of the professoriate likened that to a species of witchcraft. Here is what Trevor Roper writes about in the European witch craze of the 16th and 17th centuries. He says, credulity in high places increased. Its engines of expression were made more terrible, more victims were sacrificed to it. The years 1550 to 1600 were worse than the years of 1500 to 1550, and the years 1600 to 1650 were worse still, nor was the craze entirely separable from the intellectual and spiritual life of those years. It was forwarded by the cultivated popes of the Renaissance, by the great Protestant reformers, by the saints of the Counter-Reformation, by the scholars, the lawyers, and churchmen. So what do we do about governance? So if I had my druthers, I would have at least one spot on the Fed for somebody who would talk about the morality of money and about the way things work in the world. I think what we need, among other things, is a practitioner that has studied at the feet of Mr. Market. That is the proverbial or the personification of the market force. Someone whom Mr. Market has taken to school knows better than to think that he or she can predict the future. Rare is the PhD with practical instruction in the field of margin calls, client redemptions, or unsightly drawdowns. It is easier to believe, ladies and gentlemen, that one can foresee coming events when one hasn't been punished for trying. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here to join such a great panel. I already feel provoked and ready to fight back on behalf of a tribe of which I am not a member. As a financial historian, economic historian, I very often am studying both the economy and studying economists. And I enthusiastically endorse the implied premise of today's event, which is there is no or should not be a PhD standard for qualifying as a central banker. But I think there are some genuine risks that we're overlooking by dismissing with derogation the contributions that technical expertise can bring. Now, you've noticed that shift in my language, because a PhD, I agree with Paul absolutely, is neither necessary nor sufficient to be a good central banker. But that's because PhDs stand for something else. They're a proxy. They're a proxy for the relevant expertise for evaluating these swirling dynamics that central banks sit astride. And that's true in a rule-based system. It is utterly non-trivial to determine the interest rate path on a classical gold standard, whether we're looking at the stocks or flows of gold or market pressures moving in this or that direction. It's utterly non-trivial to navigate a world where, as Chairman Powell said last week in a hearing, the Phillips curve, which has dominated a half-century of central banking thinking, beats with but the faintest heartbeat. And so knowing how to do these things is something you could assume that your Uncle Buck can do from the Thanksgiving table, the way he might argue about immigration or gay marriage or abortion, with, although not the same legalistic trappings you might see in Supreme Court opinions on the same topic, generally drawing similar kinds of policy implications as that great body. But frankly, Uncle Buck at Thanksgiving is simply not going to have many insights into the Phillips curve. And so where then can we take these insights from? My great fear with demoting academic training, whether at the PhD level or not, informing the worldview of central bankers, is that we will relegate to a core of experts employed permanently by the Fed a body of policy making that is not theirs to exercise. To put it slightly more simply, if you show up, this is the first problem I see with the fears of overeducated central bankers. If one shows up to the Federal Reserve Board as a newly installed governor without that technical training, you'll watch the staff run circles around you, as they do include those appendices with algebra that speak to very real-world phenomena, such as output gaps, measures of inflation, unemployment, and the rest. That's my first fear, that if we in fact install those who lack that technical expertise or training, that the gap will be made by staff over whom there is minimal, if any, political accountability. My second concern is also about that gap. Because let us be clear, central bankers the world over agree on an awful lot, whatever their political priors. In the realm of technical expertise, there are these categories where we recognize that your political priors simply do not inform the correct answer. But the most interesting questions, of course, are where that technical apparatus is exhausted, where the experts disagree. And the question then becomes, what fills the gap? My fear with the characterization from both Paul and Jim is that the gap will be filled by ideology. The ideology learned at grandmother's knee. The ideology shaped by 1,000 factors, including partisan politics. Indeed, that's the defining fear of institutional central banks and central bankers, those who criticize this policy or support that policy the world over. And that is, there's always a ready proxy for the appropriate policy, and that is to favor the politician you like and to disfavor the politician you hate. And so if that gap between where expertise is exhausted, your own or a collective expertise, and the need to make a policy is filled by partisan politics, then we're in trouble indeed. And so I would reconceive our spring experience of Fed governance, and indeed the entire Trump administration's experience with Fed governance. I would give Donald Trump an A- as a president. He did very well and has done very well in appointing only one PhD economist so far in Rich Clarida. He's appointed terrific central bankers to the Federal Reserve Board. And his last two failed, I think, for good reason. Not because of their lack of PhDs, although I agree with Paul that many of the criticisms that were lodged against them were on that basis, but because there was not a sufficient presence of nonpartisan ideology from which we could predict their policy outlook. And where we're getting instead what is good for the political incumbent, then we have no need for the Fed. We can do that through politics. So that's my sense of where we are on this, with the thought that what we need really at the Fed are more people trained in both law and financial history. I think two perspectives that are, if anything, underrepresented. I want to talk instead, though, quickly, and with the time that I have left, I think we're now off to the races with the functioning clock, about something different about Fed governance related to the Board of Governors, and why I think the intellectual diversity, indeed great intellectual diversity, is a touchstone for making the best kinds of policies that we can make, and why I think Congress's design of the central bank has elegance to it, but has suffered over the last 100 years, a kind of deterioration to that governance model where the Fed's Board of Governors, which should sit on top of the Federal Reserve System, has seen significant erosion. And to get there, I want to talk a little bit then about how the Fed is constituted as a matter of law and practice. Here then is the Eccles building. I think in defense of Mariner Eccles, it is true that he did inherit $1 million. But unlike others who have inherited that much, he took that and he made a substantially greater fortune, becoming eventually one of the greatest bankers in the Western United States and the innovator of the bank holding company. I'm a very big fan of Mariner Eccles, for whom this building is named. And I think he shows, as Jim implied, just what diversity of experience can be. Eccles showed himself to be intellectually nimble at times when paying attention to inflation was indeed the hallmark of the day, at the height of the Korean conflict, whereas a generation before, still as a central banker, he had been carefully attuned to the opposite risks of deflation. I think, again, he's one of the great heroes of Fed history, and showing that those intellectual acrobatics still with a Democratic president throughout his tenure at the Fed is the kind of thing that we should want to see. That doesn't mean that you must be the child of his bigamist father's second wife and not going to college to fit the Mariner Eccles model, but we can see, of course, that excellent central bankers need not be trained to that PhD standard. Incidentally, another example of this, who I would say would not qualify in that same way as an economist, would be, in fact, Alan Greenspan. His PhD from NYU I would characterize as effectively an honorary degree, awarded as it was 25 years later, including for papers not even written for NYU. So I think the dissertation, of course, disappeared quickly after the degree conferral unearthed by Greenspan's excellent biographer, Sebastian Mallaby. All to say, we have seen and do see significant diversity at the level of central banking, and that is a very good thing. But Congress has not simply allowed this to be a political process, as Paul noted, which is true, but has organized the Fed structure in a series of ways. We see a Congress sitting on top. Not Congress alone. The president has a profound role in shaping policy, but that's in one way, and that is in appointing the leadership of both the Board of Governors and then, by tradition, the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, this is a curious structure. It was curious at the time it was created in 1935. There was no central bank like it. The governance structure that we see that came closest would have been the Banque de France in the 19th century. And as Jim can tell you, as the biographer of Walter Bagehot, Bagehot had substantially bad things to say about the Banque de France and its governance structure. This is pretty tortured. But it serves the need for intellectual diversity in a sense by having Federal Reserve banks over whom there's no political accountability participating with the politically accountable central bankers on the Board of Governors, together constituting the Federal Open Market Committee. That's been around since 1935. The problem is what we're seeing is a real issue with the fact that the Federal Reserve banks, held up as the mechanism of diversity, reflect no such thing. Federal Reserve Bank presidents do not reflect the diversity of the United States. Look simply at the map. 2 west of Dallas, right? Or sorry, 1 west of Dallas, 2 in the state of Missouri. Why this map? Well, they were struck according to a political bargain in 1914, bearing little relevance to the economic realities of the present. In that sense, the word federal and Federal Reserve System is pointing to this structure. a board of governors in Washington, D.C., with Federal Reserve districts scattered unevenly throughout the United States. There's nothing federal about this. Federalism speaks to dual sovereignty. States have sovereignty. Reserve districts do not. So in that sense, the Federal Reserve System is not federal. Because we're no longer on a commodity standard, it's not really speaking to a reserve. It's barely a system, right? Discuss. Thank you for those who know Linda Richmond's coffee talk and can remember the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, discuss. That's the Federal Reserve System today. The problem with this standard is it's created by Woodrow Wilson, who sees in his constitutional moment an opportunity to create something new and uniquely American, overlearning the lessons of 19th century central banking that had failed politically, forgetting in fact that the Bank of the United States in its second incarnation was wildly popular and almost succeeded in overriding a presidential veto that stopped its charter. And indeed, when Andrew Jackson's successor failed to instate what would have been the third Bank of the United States, this is John Tyler, his entire cabinet resigned in protest. Overlearning that lesson then decentralized central bank authority in the 20th century and created what I call the first Federal Reserve System from 1913 to 1935. And it was a failure. It failed for reasons of policy. It zagged when it should have zigged. It failed as a reason of accountability. No one knew in whom the responsibility was located. Woodrow Wilson's successor, Franklin Roosevelt, indeed a member of his administration, then oversaw the creation of the new Federal Reserve System, and that's the one that we know today, 1935, as its initiation. And the balance there struck was to have a Federal Open Market Committee that was responsible for open market operations, but tightly overseen by those who would be politically accountable through the President's appointment, the Senate confirmation, regular hearings in the Congress. Now I'm going to present some data from a forthcoming paper I've been working on with, through the Mercatus Center, and that will be published in an academic journal. And I want to show you some of the problems that we have seen. There are a few of them. Just in a couple of minutes, it'll be rapid fire. You'll have to read the paper for the rest of it. Here's the problem of vacancies. Here I'm graphing the number of times that on the Federal Open Market Committee, which again consists of the 7 governors plus 5 Reserve Bank presidents. Since 1942, one of those is the permanent member in New York, and the other 4 rotate. As you can see in this graph, we see from after President Roosevelt got things off the ground, from Truman all the way to W. Bush, we have more than 50% of the time, we have the accountability that we need on the Federal Open Market Committee by having those politically accountable members of the Board of Governors constituting a majority of that committee. It's fallen off the roof, fallen off a cliff. So we see first in the Obama administration, then in the Trump administration, that's not an exaggeration, literally 0% of the time have we seen politically accountable central bankers constituting a majority of the FOMC. And that has problems. Here I'm adjusting for those vacancies. And I'm looking at Reserve Bank versus governor participation in these meetings. So again, forget this is true simply adjusted for vacancies. I'm looking only at the universe in each FOMC meeting, which I've hand transcribed from each meeting since 1980, to look at how often the Reserve Bank presidents, voting and non-voting, participate. And what you see in this graph is that the voting presidents, and especially the non-voting presidents, in a statistically significant way, have crowded out governor participation. Again, this is not a function of vacancies. I've adjusted for vacancies. They are simply the non-voting presidents make more of that meeting, the governors much less. And this is a problem, again, for political accountability for the things that Jim and Paul have already spoken of. Take a look here again at the Reserve Bank president's salaries in 1913. As we heard Paul mention earlier, it was $12,000 for what were then called members of the Federal Reserve Board. And this is a pretty, you see with $12,000, this is pretty comparable to where those salaries were at the beginning. Here's a graphical demonstration. The purple line is adjusting that $12,000 for inflation over the years, and we see what's happened to the salaries of the chair and the governors versus the Reserve Bank average. Now I have different graphs in the paper where I take out New York, so you can, and the results are essentially the same. Central bankers at the Reserve Banks are compensated for their role, the significant role as central bankers in the economy. And for nearly the same job, governors are not. Here too, we have tenure, where governors spend much less time than Reserve Bank presidents. I think this is a good thing. I don't think that we should have central banker overlords staying for 2 decades controlling policy, but the fact that Reserve Bank presidents are staying longer is an issue. And here's my last slide, and this is the problem, the insider status. Reserve Bank presidents, and this is the great irony of Federal Reserve governance, Reserve Bank presidents tend to be the insiders. Members of the Board of Governors tend to be the outsiders. So we've got a problem. We've got a problem on our hands. I'm out of time, so let me just go quickly through what I think we should do. Legislatively, we should pay the central bankers more. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, makes £1 million a year. You might think, well, we can't pay public officials $1 million a year in the United States. Maybe that's true. But we once paid these central bankers in a way that reflected their importance. And we no longer do so today, and I think that's a problem. A regulatory change that we might make is to, the Federal Open Market Committee has by Congress the authority to set its own internal regulations, and it should make them so that the non-voting Reserve Bank presidents have a visitor status. Other central banks have this the world over. Sometimes members of government can sit and listen to central bank discussions. It's no threat to central bank independence. Of course, it's appropriate for these policymakers to be informed of each other's roles. The Reserve Bank presidents who see their role as actively controlling monetary policy, even when they lack the vote, I think is a problem. And then finally, my last comment will be what to do here is a cultural phenomenon. And the history, that earlier graph that I showed you of vacancies that fell off the cliff after George W. Bush, is a history of tit-for-tat politics, started by Democrats in 2007 and 8, and the Republicans, wounded by their bad behavior, stomped on the gas of bad faith evaluation of strong candidates. Now, what I'm delighted to see is that more Democrats have pulled back, that President Trump, and here I would disagree with Paul, has seen a very successful run in his central bank nominees, and I think this is a good thing. That does not mean throwing out the Senate's important check. And right now there are 2 pending nominees, and frankly, I am pretty eager to hear how they do, if they are indeed nominated. One about whom I have doubts, the other less so. But this senatorial check must establish a threshold to make sure that gaps are not filled by partisan influence. That said, elections have consequences, and Democrats and Republicans alike should recognize that President Obama's and President Trump's nominees will, of course, be very different. I just saw Paul look at his watch, and that's my signal to stop talking.
Thanks, Peter. Alex Pollock.
It is a delight to be on a panel with such 3 distinguished, knowledgeable, not to mention witty colleagues. Thanks, Paul, for doing this event. Thanks, Jim, for coining the term, the PhD standard. Thanks, Peter, for your careful scholarship of the central bank to the world. And how should we think about the governance of this hugely important and highly interesting institution? Should it be an econocracy? Which means, of course, a rule by the economists, and in particular, should the Fed be run by a club of PhD economists we think about today. And it does seem clear enough that having a PhD in economics can be a relevant qualification for a job in the leadership of the Fed, but it's certainly not the only one or even a necessary one, as everyone else has said, and I agree. Jim Grant mentioned the main Federal Reserve building. Peter Conti Brown showed us a picture of it, and I'm going to show us another picture of it, but I'm going to discuss the fact there are 2 main Federal Reserve buildings in Washington. This is one of them. It is the Eccles Building, as has been said. This familiar and impressive temple is named for Mariner Eccles, who was chairman of the Fed from 1934 to 48, and was also, as was also mentioned, did the very interesting thing of staying on the board after Truman refused to reappoint him as chairman. He and Truman were fighting energetically by that point, but he stayed on the board to carry out his anti-inflation crusade. Now, both Jim and Peter discussed Eccles' background. About Eccles, we read, although he neither attended college nor received any formal training in economics, Mariner Eccles became the intellectual force who led the Fed through financial crises during the Depression and World War. And as has been mentioned, he was a Salt Lake City banker. We didn't mention he owned a couple of dozen banks in addition to a number of other companies, and was a wealthy man by his 20s. And it's fair to say that this very powerful and important Fed chairman, who also caused the Banking Act of 1935 to happen through his deal with Franklin Roosevelt, bears little resemblance to an economics PhD. Now, the second main Fed building is not an interesting enough as a building to show it, but it is the Martin Building, named for William McChesney Martin, chairman of the Fed from 1951 to 1970. He holds the record tenure in the office, serving under 5 U.S. presidents, not always to the mutual happiness of Martin and the president. Martin's highest academic degree was a Bachelor of Arts in English from Yale. He also studied classics there, and perhaps that good rhetorical education prepared him to be, as Peter has written in his book, the greatest creator of language for the Federal Reserve. Martin's most famous metaphor, of course, being the punch bowl, which the Fed must take away. Martin also took classes in economics in his college days. During these classes, we learn he was astonished that his professors, the academic economists, considered his father, who was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and other Federal Reserve bankers hopelessly out of date because of their misguided warnings about the excessive speculation in the stock market of the 1920s. Needless to say, Martin's father and the other old-fashioned bankers turned out to be correct, not the professors. Here is a political cartoon. Peter mentioned that Martin was very successful up to, I'm sorry, it was Paul who mentioned it, up to the days of Lyndon Johnson. So here we have Lyndon Johnson and William McChesney Martin as portrayed by the Washington Post in 1965. They are obviously not getting along as they're scowling and pedaling in opposite directions. The Washington Post is portraying Martin as an out-of-date conservative banker. Note the high-button shoes in which he is pedaling his side of the bicycle built for two. And this is a very good cartoon, I think, to remember in case you might have thought that U.S. presidents and Fed chairmen always used to play nicely together. They didn't. Martin, among other things in his career, was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. He took a few graduate classes in economics, but never a degree, and always remained highly skeptical of economic models, economists, and forecasts. In 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the organization of the Federal Reserve, I gave a speech making a dozen predictions about the second 100 years of the Federal Reserve. One of them was this. An intriguing trend in recent decades, I said, is how economists have tended to take over the Fed, including the high office of chairman of the Board of Governors and the presidencies of the Federal Reserve banks. But there is no necessity in this, especially once we no longer believe that macroeconomics is or can be a science. I went on, I predict the Fed's next 100 years will again bring a Federal Reserve chairman who is not an economist. Well, this prediction was fulfilled more rapidly than I thought it would be. with the appointment of Jerome Powell in 2018. Chairman Powell was trained as a lawyer and has significant Wall Street experience in private equity. Peter suggested the importance of lawyers and financial historians to the Fed's deliberations. I couldn't agree more. Speaking of lawyers, I want to turn to this slide. This is the original Federal Reserve Board in 1914. The gentleman shown by the arrow is by training a lawyer. He is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board because he is the Secretary of the Treasury. And under the original Federal Reserve Act, the Secretary of the Treasury was automatically the chairman of the Fed, as Paul mentioned to us. He is William G. McAdoo, who was a lawyer, as I said, and a businessman who, among other things, built 2 railroad tunnels under the Hudson River between Manhattan and New Jersey. As Secretary of the Treasury, he's credited with helping New York replace London as the world's financial center by his handling of the crisis of the First World War. But the real power of the Federal Reserve in those days was Benjamin Strong, who was president, they called it governor at the time, of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And as we saw from Peter's salary slide, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was the big gun in those days, got paid more, was more important, and was the biggest influence in the Fed. Benjamin Strong went to work in banking right out of public high school, no college, let alone graduate school for him. He rose to president of the Bankers Trust Company before taking over the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. About him, the Federal Reserve history says, during his 14 years in office as the first president of the New York Fed, Strong's knowledge of the banking history of the United States, coupled with his intense interest in international affairs, made him a dominant force in U.S. monetary and banking affairs. And Strong could certainly be viewed as the opposite of a PhD economist. Now, if you were president of the United States, think about this. Whom would you want to pick as the head of your central bank, which also happens to be the central bank to the dollar-denominated world? Well, by principal vocation, who did get picked in chronological order, starting with the formation of the Fed, were the following. Lawyer, banker, lawyer, banker, investment banker, 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 corporate executive, financier, PhD economist. We have now reached Arthur Burns, aforementioned. Corporate executive, economist without PhD, that was Paul Volcker. PhD economist, PhD economist, PhD economist, and finally, lawyer and financier, bringing us up to the present. What do these heads of the Fed have to do? Well, a very instructive book, Leadership at the Fed, by Donald Kettle, which I heartily recommend, discusses this instructively. Its last chapter, The Chairman as Political Leader, hearkening back to Paul's emphasis on the necessary political skills of the head of the Federal Reserve, draws these conclusions, quoting, "The Fed's policymaking is inevitably political, and no institutional or even constitutional change can fix that. History demonstrates the folly of thinking that monetary management can be reduced to a process of technical adjustment. For any monetary policy," writes Kettle, "has political implications and creates political conflicts. The very attempt to shield such inherently political decisions behind technical standards and, quote, independence is itself a political strategy." Very cleverly said, I think. In framing monetary policy, he concludes the chairman operates as a political leader. He seeks to craft a policy for which he can build political support and deflect the let us say, inevitable attacks. And he must address a complex balance of political forces in the Fed's multiple constituencies. These points seem to me right, and they must make us think of Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed, 1987 to 2006, who was an economic PhD, but definitely not an academic, but who was a master politician and a master political leader, which took him all the way to being the maestro, although he could not maintain that exalted but unrealistic perception forever. In a wonderful 1997 AEI conference, which Paul found and showed us these great excerpts from, Irving Kristol also said this: most professors of economics genuinely believe they know how to run the economy and would very much like the chance to prove it. I must say I agree with that, and I will add that no one knows how to run the economy. That is something that's impossible to do, to run an economy. But it seems to me that it's true that inside every macroeconomist is a philosopher king trying to get out, and that being part of the Federal Reserve is the closest an economist can ever get to being a philosopher king, or at least an assistant deputy philosopher king. On the other hand, the will to power is hardly limited to economists. It certainly characterizes lawyers, Peter. What kind of education, we may wonder, helps us best moderate or control with wisdom that natural human will to power? Kristol went on to say in the 1977 conference, I'm not so sure the world has improved. Let me change that to be, I'm not so sure that governance has improved much since we began being governed by economic theories rather than by men of experience using some common sense. I'm not sure it has improved either. And yet, I think the famous line of Keynes has some force here, that such practical men, as Keynes said, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. We all operate on the theories that we get from somewhere, maybe from defunct economists. Now, Peter mentioned the importance of intellectual diversity on the Federal Reserve Board and in the Federal Reserve System. I couldn't agree more. I think this is an absolutely essential idea, and that informing a Federal Reserve Board as informing any board, you have to think of the board as a portfolio of skills, approaches, talents, and intellectual ability, and of course, political ability, as we have said. Well, in summing up, are we better off for having had a PhD standard for most of the recent decades compared to what might have been? Seems like we may not be, but as with other counterfactual speculations, we will never know. Thinking of the future, it seems safe to predict that the Federal Reserve staff, as has been said, will continue to be full of economics PhDs. And if I were in the Federal Reserve Board, I'd make sure I hired plenty of economics PhDs along with lawyers, and I'd hire some financial historians too for perspective, and others to advise and help the leadership carry out its duties. But can we think that now, with Chairman Powell, we have the start of a new phase of Federal Reserve leadership? The return of the model of experience and practical knowledge, especially knowledge in financial markets, combined with the necessity for political leadership, like, let us say, Eccles, Martin, McAdoo, and Strong. What is the future of econocracy at the Fed? Perhaps econocracy and the PhD standard will prove to have been a passing fashion, like other central bank fashions which over the years come and go. Personally, holding the academic rank of Master of Arts and having spent many years as practicing banking, that seems to me like a good idea. Thank you.
If we could take the stage. So we'll take a few minutes for the panelists to maybe react to their fellow panelists. Then we'll open up questions from the audience. But I want to start with a question for Peter. Peter, do you think they'll get that salary up to $1 million for a governor before they require historian lawyers?
Well, that would sure change a lot of people's incentive profiles. I don't think so. I think that we have seen some Republicans and Democrats alike, usually the party not in power in the House, criticize any efforts to give our members of Congress a raise. And this is, I think, should be an embarrassment to anyone who does. The idea here is not that they're sucking on the teat of the public here. The idea is to allow people the flexibility at a stage when their skill set is marketable elsewhere to engage in public service without bankrupting their family or without representing a significant change in their lifestyle. To be clear, be a central banker when that skill set is so highly marketable elsewhere means you're either independently wealthy or you're playing some sort of graft game. And that's the thing I fear about that level. What I'd like to see is, I don't want the Reserve Bank presidents to be paid less. I'd like to see the governors paid a lot more.
Fair enough. Let me ask the panelists first, starting with you, Jim. Do you have anything you want to say or ask your fellow panelists?
I have a question for Peter. Why doesn't $15,000 go as far as it used to?
Of course, the answer there is inflation, and yet the stubborn problem of the modern era is too little, not too much. My question then back to Jim would be: Are those who are beating a drum, especially about the morality of even 2% inflation, have they overlearned the lessons of a generation and a half ago? Is it time to be in 2019 and not 1979?
Well, one might say that in a time of rapid material and technological progress, that one would expect prices to fall, not rise. And that attempts to offset this decline, which, by the way, most Americans seem not to resent, rather spend most of their weekends chasing these opportunities. But in an attempt to reverse what might be expected as natural fall in prices, the central bank counters that with infusions of bank credit. That bank credit is going to find its mischievous way into other places, like, for example, financial markets and financial assets, the levitation of which might sow social resentment, discord, and might lead to the election of people that certain others would resent.
I would add here, we have to remember that one of the macroeconomic intentions and functions of central bank-induced inflation is to reduce real wages. This goes back to certainly to Keynes. The Fed never talks about this, of course, but it's one of the key things to try to allow adjustment with so-called sticky wages, so you can reduce real wages anyway. So we've seen, Peter, the Federal Reserve governors be reducing their own real wages through this inflation over time. There's some poetic justice in that. Nobody knows things like what's the right inflation rate to have. It seems to me the 2% goal is in fact mistaken. It was originally set up as a reduction to 2%, not an increase to 2%. And we always have the problem, like in finance, when people are trying to predict market prices, they pore over history and they find which various periods seem to fit their theory. The same may be true about trying to find a theory of inflation. The more you think these things can be run by a body of experts who know the right answer to what the interest rate should be, what the real interest rate should be, what the neutral interest rate should be, what the right inflation rate is, the more trouble you're likely to get in. And one of the things I like the most about Chairman Powell when he came in was his wonderful speech on the so-called stars, which are these neutral, the right inflation rate and real interest rate and so on, which he pointed out these are theoretical speculations that no one knows the answer to. It was a great speech. He was absolutely right. And that brings the kind of knowledge that comes out of engagement with the financial world, I think, to the deliberations of the Fed. And that was extremely positive, I thought.
I want to add to that a little bit. Chairman Powell is sort of a back-in-time kind of refresh thing. McChesley, Martin seemingly never wanted to talk about money growth. The staff always wanted to talk about money growth. He didn't believe in it. Paul Volcker was reported to basically ignore every inflation forecast his staff ever made because they were always wrong. Alan Greenspan sent the staff off in the late 1990s to somehow find the productivity increases that intuitively he thought were there and changing the way the economy worked, and it was his intuition, not data. Sometimes it's the hunch and the intuition that makes the chairman a good call, and of course they can be wrong too, right? I mean, it can go either way. Some of them get lucky. I want to come back and ask Jim Grant a question. So you had a Wall Street Journal, nice Wall Street Journal op-ed on Friday about one of the current nominees or potential nominees and the gold standard, and today you came back to the gold standard. And one of the issues with the gold standard, really the last two tries at it in the 1930s and Bretton Woods, to the extent that we were still convertible, the US converted into gold, was a political problem, the same as we've always had. The adjustment problem. Countries, the agreements were there, but countries had to voluntarily make the adjustment to keep the standard in place, and the politicians, when push came to shove, just refused to do it. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that and your views on that?
Well, the essence of the gold standard, two things, very simple things. One is that you define the currency as a weight of something, of gold in this case, and you allow money full freedom to leave and enter the country, and you don't interfere with that entry and exit. Under a gold standard, money is defined as something fixed, and wages and prices do the adjusting. Under the present day regime, wages and prices do less adjusting, and money value is variable and manipulated in the interests of the stability and growth of the macroeconomy. That's kind of the essential differences. There is no one gold standard. The classical version, which Arthur Bloomfield celebrated in a New York Fed monograph as recently as 1959, that ended with the First World War, as did so many other liberal institutions, and succeeding it were kind of the roadshow gold exchange standard and the high school drama club version of that, Bretton Woods. They were not really gold standards. So my point in that op-ed piece is not so much to argue for the reimposition of the classical gold standard. That certainly would not be possible. And I dare say for most people, even people like even Uncle, what's his name at Thanksgiving?
Oh, I said Buck.
Buck, yeah. Buck. I'm not even sure that Buck would like it at first hearing, but rather to welcome someone who is at least going to enter into the discussion such things as, like, for example, the inflation rate. Now, Peter, you said that we ought to eschew ideology and move away from that. But I would kind of submit that there is an ideology inherent in every single doctrine of modern-day central banking. For example, the idea that prices ought to rise by 2% a year, that's an ideological statement. I would say, in my own ideology, that money is work, therefore money is heartbeats. And the organized attempt to raise the rate of inflation to 2% plus or minus is, first of all, an act of arrogance, as if they could do that, as if the data were accurate enough to allow it. Witness, I refer people back to Morgenthau's on the accuracy of economic observations. The data are not there to do that. And secondly, who says it's okay? Alex has written most eloquently on this. So there's in one of the Little House in the Prairie books, maybe it's Farmer Boy. The boy is at a country fair and his father is standing by him. The kid asks for 25 cents to buy the crowd a lemonade. And his father hands him like a 50-cent piece, and the kid is gobstopped. He doesn't know what to say. And the old man says, "You know what this is? kid, of course, says nothing. He said, that's work. You steal it? You set out to reduce that through public policy. I don't know. I mean, but Peter, it's an ideological position.
Can I respond to that? I could not agree more with Jim. I don't want to weed out ideology. I want to understand it. Any central banker who disclaims the presence of ideology has, I think, probably the most worrisome of ideologies, one that controls their thinking without their awareness. So ideology and worldview, ubiquitous. We shouldn't fear it. We should understand it. We should understand its limits. And I think there are real benefits for having the dissenting voice in the room who sees the world in a very, very different way. But I would put it to you that I think all of us would agree that Uncle Buck's ideology is reflexive because he read on the internet somewhere something that somebody wrote, that Buck isn't the guy for this. We want something more. And being able to specify, despite the fact that these processes, these governance processes, are highly political and highly historical and historically contingent, we have a sense, all of us intuitively, about what tolerance for dissent we would permit. And I don't know where I would draw lines where I would say, yes, this is a dissenting view that will enrich discussion versus this is a dissenting view that will hijack discussion. And I worry that when we see so much literature by technical experts evaluating the claims of those who are enthusiastic for commodity standards and reject them for all the reasons that these gold standards and gold exchange standards have been rejected, but I think we should take that very seriously as a body of knowledge that's been created. But I'm not saying that there should never be anyone who's enthusiastic for commodity rules to participate in those hallowed halls. I think the harder work will be dividing those appropriate dissents from not.
I need to get to the audience here. So first, we're going to go to the audience for some questions. And when the mic comes, wait for the mic. And please keep your question brief and tell us who you are first. But before we do that, I'm going to do something unusual. And I'm going to pick on one of the audience members. Over here is Matthew Fink, who wrote the definitive biography of Carter Glass, who was the author of the original Federal Reserve Act. And Matt, I want to ask you to ask our experts here, put on your best Carter Glass thinking cap and channel your Carter Glass and ask one question to our experts, please.
Ask the experts?
Yeah, there's the mic, please, Matt.
I'm sorry, I could ask what they think Carter Glass's view on this would be, on who should be on the Federal Reserve Board, what kind of qualifications, if any.
Having read thousands of pages of Carter Glass's voluminous archive, I can tell you what he would want. Small-town bankers.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and he'd be with Jim on have anything like a fiat currency. Literally called those fighting words when the Fed, by its critics, was accused of creating a fiat system. So he's a deep enthusiast for commodities. He's a deep enthusiast for Jeffersonian democracy. So he would not like the idea of technocrats. But there's a lot not to like about Carter Glass. So luckily, his voice isn't the one that defines everything for us.
And to say something that you already know very well, he of course wouldn't want a powerful, centralized body in Washington, which he fought tooth and nail in 1935 when Mariner Eccles and Franklin Roosevelt centralized the Federal Reserve.
Matt, you and Peter are going to notice I'm losing the name of the New York Republican senator who gave that great speech in the floor of the Senate against the Federal Reserve Bill, who became a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winner.
Yes, I know who you mean.
Anyway, there was a Glass attacked his critique of the Federal Reserve note and proceeded to lay out the beauty, the essential beauty of the design and the function of the Federal Reserve Act. It was, and to this day, there are two kind of atavistic features of the Fed that Peter and Matt know better than I, but the two of them strike me so much. One is the nomenclature that we call the Federal Reserve currency, that we call a note. Well, a note is an obligation, it's a debt obligation, it's a promise to pay. So that has lasted from 1971, and now it's like the Brooklyn Dodgers have more time in LA than they had in Brooklyn. So the Federal Reserve note is a piece, is an IOU nothing for longer than it was. Anyway, that's one. And the second thing is that in the fine print of the of the documents representing ownership of shares in the various regional Federal Reserve banks, there is a contingency for a capital call in the event that the capital of the particular reserve bank becomes impaired or that bank becomes insolvent, which are the throwbacks in the pre-1935 organization of the banking system, whereby the stockholder was responsible for the solvency of the institution in which they held a fractional interest. So there's more ideology. Who owns the downside? Well, now it's the taxpayer, right? That too is fueling, it seems to me, one aspect of our politics that not all approve of. Anyway,
Well,
you wrote the book, Matt.
Having embarrassed me with a question which I wasn't ready for, I give something else. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, and it strikes me similarity to the Supreme Court, where we now have, not only are they all lawyers now, all not been for a while, but they're all from Harvard and Yale, I think, if I'm so. And I think that's a mistake, and I think we've had very good justices before who are not lawyers. So my own view is diversity is a good thing. Some other people on the panel said, I don't think you'd want 7 of them or whatever, 5 of them all PhD economists, nor would you want them all bankers.
Can we take a question here? How about right up front here?
Thank you. Hello. My name is Sana. I'm an economics student at Dartmouth and an intern here at AEI. Thank you all for being here. It was a very informative talk. My question is for Professor Conti Brown and also for all of you. In one of your slides, you had a picture of the percent of vacancies over presidents, and you mentioned something about politically accountable central bankers. I was wondering if you could explain that relationship and also perhaps define what that means to be a politically accountable central banker.
Great question.
Really great question. Gets to the heart of our conversation here, and that's about governance. My book, The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve, is attacking as a myth the idea of a hermetic seal around the Fed, that politics is this great parasite that can infect judgment of central banking. But Jim's point is a very good one, even where we disagree about or have differences in ideology. Making choices about these hard questions needs to reflect the fact that there are people who in good faith disagree. And Churchill's great axiom that democracy is the worst possible system except for everything else that's been tried, and should inform us here. Elections have consequences. And the consequences of those elections are that the president gets to pick, subject to historical and political factors, and the Senate gets to exercise their duty to advise and consent, who gets to be the central banker and whose ideology is going to shape these hard questions. And that is what it means to be politically accountable, is that you've come through a political process. Some had proposed that the chairs of the Ivy League economics departments should choose the Federal Reserve Board. And I think each one of us here would profoundly disagree with that idea.
Some more emphatically than others.
I would very emphatically disagree with that idea. And that's the political accountability. And that compares to the Federal Reserve Bank presidents, who are not subject to any kind of process in their appointment. And some people would say, well, that's diversity. But as I showed, they're insiders.
Let me take issue with that last statement about the presidents being independent. In the last half dozen years, when there was a presidential vacancy, the Congress members weighed in, sent clear messages that they wanted people of a certain kind to be presidents of the bank, and the board of governors has to approve the president that gets nominated. And I think the presidents of the banks have become a political football issue in the last few years, whereas for many years that was kind of hands off, and the board would, but it's gotten way more political.
Let me try perhaps a more fundamental response. You're a Dartmouth person, right? All right. So it was a Dartmouth man, Amos Kendall, who supposedly wrote most of one of the great state papers, which was President Jackson's veto of the renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. That was in 1932. And Kendall, apart from 1832, yeah. And Kendall, apart from the dispositive pedigree of Dartmouth, was one of the great media moguls of his time. It was a Politico, and anyway, what he said, or what Jackson said through Kendall in the state paper was that, I'm going to paraphrase this, but probably not very well, but he said, the problem lies with Congress delegating the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof and foreign current coins and so forth. They can't delegate that. That's their power. They shouldn't delegate. And they went on to say that to the extent that that power is delegated for a term of years, the Constitution is dead. So the political question begins with the very existence of a central bank to which is delegated the specific congressional power over monetary matters. Right? It's not a matter of whether Jared Kushner gets on the Federal Reserve Board so much as this is a radical. The first question is, why do we have this delegation? Jackson and Kendall wrote a very eloquent condemnation of it. But we all proceed as if that question was settled. It is settled. It's settled in law, but is it settled in ideology and philosophy?
Alex?
The question of accountability, and it comes back to one of Peter's slides, which he had the U.S. Congress up on top of the organization chart with the Board of Governors reporting to the U.S. Congress, and that fits the notion that the Congress has under the Constitution, not the executive, not the White House. Yeah. Although, of course, the presidents like Lyndon Johnson on the bicycle built for two with William McChesney Martin are always involved. But under the Constitution, it's the Congress that has the money power. Paul Tucker, the former deputy governor of the Bank of England, just wrote a big, long book all about accountability of central banks called Unelected Power, in which he struggles mightily for 570 pages about how do these unelected central bankers be made accountable in a democratic regime, and they have to be made accountable, according to him, principally to the legislature. I agreed to review this book, and the editor said, great, we'll send you one, and then I got it and saw how long it was, and I thought, what have I done? But I did read it all, and for 570 pages, he struggles with it. And it's hard. It's hard. And there's a long list of things, of reforms at the end of the book, which he thinks we ought to do. But one of the most important ones is to have a meaningful, true accountability of the central bankers to the elected representatives of the people who are the ultimate authority.
One of the things I think that comes out of that is in England, they have dedicated committees in the parliament that are almost like nonpartisan think tanks that know a whole lot about an issue, and these get involved. Whereas in the U.S. Congress, one of the problems, in my view, and one of the reasons all the think tanks exist is because the congressional staffs are so poorly paid. Congress doesn't have, they won't vote themselves large staffs with enough salary to really hire people with seniority and expertise in the issues, and so they have a hard time overseeing the Federal Reserve and understanding the nuances, all the difficulties and complexities. And the Fed, as you note, has somewhere between 500 and 700 economists at the board, and they're very good at complicated explanations and don't look at this but look at that and look the other way. And Congress is outmaneuvered time and time again. We don't have that same setup here. So the oversight. But to come back by congressional oversight, there are also times in history. I mean, the presidents clearly jawbone the Fed for what they want, but Congress does too. Congress gets involved and says lower interest rates. Why are interest rates? You can find all kinds of episodes of that over history. So both branches do get involved. Let's take another question over here, please.
My name is Bonnie Wachtel, long-term fan of everyone up there. Work in the markets. I'll address this to Jim Grant. My understanding of your comments would be that the Fed is already politically accountable. It's basically the mirror image of the entitlement state, but it's not sustainable. What they're doing is not sustainable, and then ultimately is going to lead to some very unfortunate dislocation, not just in this country, but throughout the developed world, these policies. And in the interim, while people try to figure that out, they're just taking baby steps. It's the markets that will dislocate and decide whether change is going to be made. The question goes to a topic we're hearing constantly about these days, which is cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, now Libra, the basket of currencies. Do you read that? When we hear about the concerns about it, it's usually in terms of anti-money laundering and good stuff like that. But I have a sense that the real rhetorical thrust of that is a statement coming up from the grassroots of the forward-thinking technology people saying, look, Fed and other central bankers, we want out of this system. You know, we're very early adopters, but that's the message of those movements. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that the cryptocurrency things in practice are great speculative volleyballs, but in creation and in conception, they are kind of a cry for help on the part of some very thoughtful people about the present day state of monetary affairs. You think, in a way you think, what's wrong with things as they are? Things are kind of okay. There's no noisy clamor for fundamental change in our monetary lives. There was in the 70s, but not today. But I don't mean to lay too much on the Fed. I mean, money is not humanity's best subject, and credit is worse. Under the classical gold standard, when stockholders were responsible for the solvency of their own banks, and when money was defined as a weight of something, there were periodic panics having to do with the abuse of lending and borrowing. That seems to me to be something inherent in mankind and not a feature of any one system. It's common to these systems. Where I think the problem today is that the interest rates being prices, being critical prices, being probably the most important prices of capitalism, they have been under the thumb for the past 10 years of willful macroeconomists who wish to change the world through the manipulation of these sensitive prices. Walter Bagehot said, John Bull, he said, alluding to the national symbol of Britain, he said, John Bull can stand many things, but he can't stand 2%. He meant that very low rates of interest induce speculative behavior, which always invariably ends in tears. Well, we have had 10 years of 0% money market interest rates or thereabouts, and now we have had many, many months of this novelty and apparently a non sequitur of negative, substantially negative, not bill yields, but bond yields. There are like 13 junk bonds traded in euros that are yielding less than nothing. These are speculative grade credits. And it's not even as if people are hiding their money away in the theory that sovereign governments are going to pay. No, this is, to me, this is a great deformation of our capital markets. It's the destruction of bond markets as censors of prices, of credit risk. Yes, and I think it's going to have a very bad ending.
Bonnie, private money, as cryptocurrency is, at least in some of its manifestations, is hardly anything new. Coming back to Stuckey's Bank, of which Walter Bagehot was a director and therefore had unlimited personal liability to the liabilities of the bank, issued bank notes, which circulated, Stuckey's bank notes. And Jim has a marvelous story in his book about the lady who came into Stuckey's Bank and wanted to take all her money out of the bank, out of her deposit. They offered her Bank of England notes in payment, and she said, no, I want Stuckey's bank notes instead, which they paid her in because they were so highly thought of. Of course, once you have private money of any kind, that's a liability. Against that liability are some set of assets or other. And if you have any purveyors of private monies issuing liabilities, the real question is, what are the assets against that money? And as soon as there's much of a mismatch between the risk characteristics of the assets and the liabilities,
Adam and Eve.
That's the temptation, and the result is sin and fall, namely financial crisis.
So we were originally scheduled to end at 11:30. Do you have trains to catch, or you have time for one more question?
One more.
One more
Yeah.
question, just one, right back here. Please be concise.
Yeah, Rich Miller with Bloomberg. My understanding was like one of the reasons for Fed independence was, the lawmakers couldn't be trusted to bring down inflation. Now that, inflation is a problem, is not perceived as a problem, does that sort of undercut the argument for Fed independence?
So the intellectual history of the independence of central banks has zagged and zigged along the way. What you're describing, that economists call the time consistency problem, right? This is the reason for the chaperone at the party pulling away the punch bowl. Doesn't take formal root until the 1970s, at which point that structure spreads like wildfire in the 1980s and 90s. But as Jim can tell you, the 19th century discussion of separation, even the 17th century discussion of separation, is about disciplining of politicians who, if they don't want to inflate away their problems, they might want to behead their creditors. And so separating that out is an important function. But with the inversion of of that worldview, especially during the Obama administration, this is, of course, the political environment has changed substantially since then, where populism clamored for harder money. It's something that the Fed hadn't seen before. And the durability of monetary politics is stronger than virtually anything. Remember that William McKinley, the great Republican president, was an ultra-protectionist. That was orthodoxy for the Republican Party. But hard money had been orthodoxy for the Republican Party for even longer. And so I think what we saw in 2009, 2016 was a real challenge to that durability. What we're seeing now is a real challenge to that durability. And so I think that the discussions about Fed independence should and are migrating accordingly.
As Donald Kettle said in that quote that I cited in my talks, independence itself is a political position which enters into the politics of central banking.
With that, let me thank Peter, Jim, Alex. Thanks for great panelists, great discussion, and thank you all for attending, and hope to see you again.
Hey, Peter, I enjoyed it.
Great to see you. Same.